Cast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
All right, hello everyone. It's just about noon. We'll get started in another minute or so here, so just hang tight and we will get going right away. All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Katie Makahonyuk. I am the Plant Health Officer for SARM Division 1. Most of you have probably heard me already on these webinars. I hope that they've been helpful to you so far. So today we're going to kind of switch gears from what we've been doing. We're going to cover some frequently asked questions, just situations that weed inspectors may run into on the job. First up, we're going to have Rennie Grills presenting. He's most of you are probably familiar with him, but he's a seasoned weed inspector and very knowledgeable in terms of invasive plants, that kind of thing. So just some housekeeping first. We're going to keep everyone muted for the duration of the call. As usual, questions can be asked in the questions box or the chat box. We'll get to them as soon as we can. And yeah, if you need any other help, just feel free to ask. So Rennie, I'll switch it over to you and you can go ahead.
Okay, thanks, Katie. Can you see my PowerPoint, Katie? Okay, I'm taking
all good.
that.
You're ready to go.
All good?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. New technology, you can never guarantee it's going to work. So good afternoon, everyone. My name's Rennie Grills, and I guess I wear multiple hats, and so I was asked to speak today about some of the questions that are commonly asked by weed inspectors. I work full-time for the Meewasin Valley Authority here in Saskatoon, but I'm also a weed inspector for a couple municipalities outside of Saskatoon as well. So a good chunk of my life is spent dealing with invasive species of all sorts, whether it's in my full-time professional job or in my spare time as a weed inspector. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through a few questions that I commonly hear when weed inspectors get together on field tours or we meet in the field, and try and address some of those questions. But some of them, I don't have all the answers either, but maybe it at least gets everyone start thinking about what some potential solutions to some of these questions are. So let's see. So just a little bit about Meewasin. Meewasin, we're here in Saskatoon. We look after 6,700 hectares of land in the South Saskatchewan River Valley, incorporating the city of Saskatoon and within the Arm-McCormick Park. And we have a three-prong approach for our mandate. It's conservation, so that's where my program is under resource management, is managing the River Valley and our Meewasin sites. We provide education and outreach to the public. We do a lot of school programming, but also a lot of public programs as well for the general public. A lot of the work that I do from that perspective is on things like invasive species and land management aspects. And then too, we do have a development mandate. And so if you've ever been to Saskatoon and you've been along the trails along the River Valley, that's Meewasin. We build those trails for the public here in Saskatoon. And so this just sort of shows the Meewasin Valley. So like I said, it's 6,700 hectares. We cover the River Valley from tip to tip in the Arm-McCormick Park, which is about 80 kilometers long. And we have a really diverse landscape of habitats. So we have everything from islands in the river to riverbank slopes to native grasslands within city limits and outside of city limits. And we also get a lot of pressure from invasive species. So we're sort of on that front between the agricultural weeds that are, coming in from pasture lands or crop fields, but also we're experiencing a lot of new weeds that are coming out of people's backyards as well. And so we're trying to, we're sort of dealing with a whole suite of different invasive species. And then even things coming down the river valley from upstream, say Alberta coming into Saskatchewan, we typically find a lot of unique new species of invasive species coming down the riverbank. So I'm also been appointed as weed inspectors with the arm of Aberdeen, 373, and the arm of Fish Creek. And so I live in the town of Aberdeen, and so I was appointed as weed inspector there about 4 years ago now. And then the following year, Fish Creek asked me to be the weed inspector as well. And so really, when you think about the river valley, Fish Creek and Aberdeen are along the South Saskatchewan River, up to about Waka, almost Batoche actually is the north end of Arm of Fish Creek. So I have quite a big chunk of the river valley that sort of falls into the territory I deal with invasives. Also, as part of my role, I do some invasive species control as well. Within Meewasin, our sites are within Corman Park and Saskatoon, so I do control there. But I also do control within the Arm of Aberdeen, and I do a little bit of control with the Arm of Fish Creek as well. So, a weed inspector, we're not necessarily herbicide applicators, but quite a few of us are herbicide applicators as well. But definitely those are two different roles than being a weed inspector. So just sort of a list of some of the common questions we get is, what are some ways, good resources to identify invasive species, about using Imap Invasives for storing your data, what herbicides would you recommend? How and when should I scout for my weeds? Biocontrols, do they really work? Who can I call upon if I have questions? How do I deal with weeds in highway ditches and along railway tracks, gravel pits? And then also, I think we have an opportunity for people to ask questions as well, to myself and Clark and Katie. So in terms of identification resources, there's a lot of books you can buy on weeds. Quite often they're fairly thick manuals, but there's also some different materials. So the Saskatchewan Forage Council produced the Invasive Plant Species Guide several years ago. It's in its second print, and it's a really good pocket-sized resource. I keep multiple copies in my truck, both my Meewasin truck and my personal truck, that I can hand out to landowners and producers. And it's a great guide of sort of the top 20-some weeds that we would find here in Saskatchewan, with really good pictures on identification, growth habits, and then also some control methods as well. So my understanding from the Forage Council that they're pretty much out of stock of that booklet, but you can actually find it on their website, saskforage.ca, and they're available there for download as well, if you can't find any copies of it. Also, the Saskatchewan Invasive Species Council has published a series of fact sheets on different invasive species, and this is building on the work that was done by the Alberta Invasive Plant Council. And really, these fact sheets are really good identifiers of plants from both the stem, the leaves, and flowers. Also, they talk about prevention and control methods as well, and breaking down the control methods as well in terms of what kind of herbicides or what kind of mechanical or biocontrol options are available. And so, really valuable fact sheets. Unfortunately, right now, the Sask Invasive Species website's under redevelopment, and so you can't access these fact sheets. The goal is to have the website up and running again in April is the goal. But you can also find those fact sheets on the Saskatchewan Conservation Data Center website, and then also the Alberta Invasive Plant Council has a lot of the same information on their websites as well. Also, quite often we get calls on different native plant species, quite often we get a phone call of potential invasive species or plant species that turns out to be a wildflower. And there is quite a few different guides that are available for wildflower identification to sort of pick them out to see whether it's an invasive plant or a wildflower. But what I find is there's a website by Glenn Lee here in Saskatchewan called saskatchewanwildflowers.ca. And his website has really good pictures of wildflower species, but he also has pictures of a lot of invasive species as well, plant species as well, and really detailed pictures as well. So if you get those calls on something like, especially if you got wild parsnip in your area, or when it hits the media every year, quite often you can go into Glenn Lee's website and you can find some of the different species that look similar, like heartleaved Alexander is quite often mistaken for wild parsnip. And so you can go in there and you can confirm by looking at those photos. And it's a great resource for that comparison. So, hopefully soon, the Invasive Species Council's website will be up to date with the new fact sheets, and then that'll be made available for everyone. But also contact your plant health officer as well. And if you can't find a fact sheet on some of these invasive species, they can help source them for you as well. Imap Invasives. So Imap Invasives is a citizen science database that's used to store invasive plant and invasive species information as well. So even things like wild boar and zebra mussels data can be stored in this database. And so it's the tool that's being used in Saskatchewan through the Saskatchewan Conservation Data Center for mapping and documenting invasive species occurrences. Also, the platform is really good at documenting your management treatments as well. So if you're using biocontrol agents or even your herbicide application, you can actually document the locations that you've been spraying and map them out through that database. And it's a really good way of keeping long-term data available. And it also provides a valuable resource for people, whether you're the plant health officers or the Ministry of Agriculture, for knowing where the weed occurrences are throughout the province. One of the challenges, though, with it is new technology. So this was a weed workshop that was done in Beardy's Okomasis a couple of years ago, when pre-COVID, when we could get together in groups. And we spent some time with us weed inspectors out learning how to use Imap Invasives. So the top picture there is Burl Waite with the Conservation Data Center. She manages the Imap Invasives database. And Marcel, he's the wind inspector for the Armored Duck Lake, and she's teaching Marcel how to try and use Imap Invasives. So this next slide shows actually from the work that I've been doing in the Arm of Aberdeen using Imap Invasives. So the top, or the map on the right, was actually from the first year that I went out and I was doing mapping for the Arm of Aberdeen to get the different weed occurrences. And so I was just using a simple handheld GPS unit, collected the data points, converted into a map, and to give us sort of that nice colored rainbow of the weed occurrences within the Arm of Aberdeen. What really, you could see the real red lines. What really got the RM involved in pointing me as the weed inspector was we had a wild parsnip outbreak. And so I've been working on that for the last 4 years to try and knock back the wild parsnip. So those are the red lines in that map. And then on the left map is the data that I pulled. I just went into Imap Invasives. I zoomed into the Arm of Aberdeen, and all that data is shown of all the occurrences of weeds that I've ever added to that database. So I've taken my handheld GPS data, sent it to Burl, and she uploaded it into Imap Invasives. And so you can see all those little individual dots are different weed occurrences. If you zoom in into the, I don't know if you could see my mouse, but there's a little green patch there. I did some custom application. This acreage owner here, he had 10 acres of solid wild parsnip, and I did some spraying for him. And so then I mapped that entire patch that I sprayed for him. And to provide, and so that was actually added into the database as well. And so it really gives you some of that long-term information of weed occurrences, where they were located. Also, when other people add findings when they're, say, driving through the RM that you're working in, you can also check to see if there's any new occurrences that you didn't know about. So sort of every May when I start planning my field season for the RM, I go in and check Imap invasives to see if there's any new species that I didn't know about or any new locations that maybe someone might have documented for me. And then I use that for targeting my weed program. And this gives you a really good zoom in on how close, how accurate that data is. I wasn't able to pull in an air photo, but this is actually my backyard in Aberdeen. And that dot that's in the square there is creeping bellflower, which is not listed as a noxious weed, but is an aggressive invasive plant that escapes out people's backyards. And that's actually right off my deck in my backyard. So it shows you how detailed that mapping can be. And you can use it to really pinpoint. So on this map actually is where that square is, that's creeping bellflower, which is listed. The next dot right beside it is Himalayan balsam. It's not listed as well, but it's actually a potential really aggressive invasive species. And then that next dot is actually on the back alley against my fence, and that is oxeye daisy. So, provides really good pin location data to go back and follow up for invasive species control. One of the next questions is, what herbicides should I use? And, there's so many, when you're applying herbicides, you do have to be a registered herbicide applicator. I'm an industrial herbicide applicator, which allows me to spray in certain conditions, namely road ditches and other industrial sites. And the herbicides that are recommended are for specific species and also for what type of herbicide applicator's license you have and the site that you're spraying. So through the SARM invasive plant control program, last year in the Schedule A, provided really good information on which herbicides can be used for which invasive species. And so quite often when I get phone calls either from producers or even other conservation agencies that I work with, I refer them directly to this table. And it really provides a really good basic information of which herbicides to use, and then you can research further. Also, the Saskatchewan Ministry of Agriculture puts out the crop production guide. This is for ag lands, but also it provides a good background on all the different herbicide options available for in agricultural lands for invasive species. And so, these are sort of my two go-to documents that I always keep in the trucks with me, and I refer to all the time. And then each company as well provides information on their herbicide products, whether it's Corteva or BASF or Monsanto. They have more detailed information. Also, the herbicide label itself provides really good information as well. So this gives you a good foundation to at least know what to look for herbicides, and then you can start planning based on those recommendations. One thing that we did at Meewasin was we built, in partnership with South Saskatchewan River Watershed Stewards, they received funding from the City of Saskatoon and a few other partners to develop to take sort of the concept of the bile bed to handle herbicide rinsate. So this is the extra material from your quad sprayer or hand sprayer, and how to deal with that. And so taking that rinsate out and using microbes and fungus in a compost mix to break down that herbicide. That bottom middle picture is there's a picture of Tom Al. Oh, sorry, I forget Tom's last name, and he's been using, working in the ag industry for quite a few years on looking at biobeds for handling this rinsate. And so we worked with him on a design on something very simple and to handle this rinsate. And so you can see we got 2 containers there, which are leftover herbicide containers. We cut them open, have a spout to drain them. We made a compost mix of straw and manure and soil, and it produced a nice white fungus, and we add our herbicide rinsate into it, and it breaks down that those active ingredients in that herbicide. Some of the research has shown that up to 95 to 99% of the active ingredients are broken down over a 2-year period with using those microbes. And so it's something that we've been using and encouraging other municipalities to look at for dealing with their herbicide rinseate. Next question, when is the best time to scout for weeds? So ideally you should be out scouting before the plant is flowering, and so that you can time your herbicide or control methods before it goes to seed, and also to be most effective. However, it's quite difficult to identify. You know, you're driving down the road or the highway at 40 miles an hour or faster, and you're trying to identify weeds. And if you don't know what they look like prior to flower, it can be quite difficult. So, the easiest time to identify is, of course, when it's flowering. It's really distinct. Like you can see here, this nice leafy spurge patch along a grid road. So it becomes quite easy to identify. And so, don't feel bad about doing that. I think it's a great way to know where the weed populations are. You can document them then, and if it's too late to do herbicide application or other control methods, at least you can plan your work for next year. So you can inform your municipality, say, I found this new weed, or we have this one problem area. It was too late to do any control methods, but we can go back next year and start getting a handle on it. And so, the first step is actually spotting and identifying, and then developing a strategy based on that. Also, after flowering, so in the wintertime is actually sometimes a good time to be spotting your weeds as well. If anyone has common tansy in their municipalities, they're very distinct. Really, I have a picture later on. They really stick out in the wintertime. And so even at this time of year, you could be out spotting or scouting for your weeds in your RM as well, and make note of it, and then you can go back and follow up in the spring and start your control methods. So any time of the year is good for scouting. Best time is before flowering, but any time is really good to do that. And the key is to know where the weeds are so that you can start dealing with them. Next question was, do bile control agents work? And I think a lot of people, when they work with bile control agents, they think they hope that could be a really quick fix. Like when you're using herbicide, you spray it, it's dead. You can see leaves curling within a week or two, and you know that you're having an impact. However, if you're using bile control agents, you're looking at it as a marathon, right? You're looking at this as a long-term approach for dealing with those weeds. So myself at Meewasin, we've been dealing with working with the plant health officers for controlling, collecting leafy spurge beetles every year for almost 8 years now. And we have multiple locations within our jurisdiction that we cannot apply herbicide. We're either really close to the river, or it's a site that's used by the public that herbicides are not an option. And so what we're using is those biocontrol beetles to handle in those areas. And over time, our goal is to knock those populations, those leafy spurge populations down to a manageable level. Typically also where we do the reintroduction of those beetles is in patches that are really thick, that we'll target our herbicide application on those outliers where we can easily hit and knock back, but those really dense patches in the middle, or maybe in the middle of a aspen stand that we know we can't get the herbicide into there, that's where we'll target the release of the beetles as well. So, and we know that this is going to take a long time approach, and so we factor that in our planning, is that this is a 10-year, 15-year effort to use the beetles to get this under control. There's also some new different biocontrol agents that are being developed. We worked with Agriculture Canada on a release near Alvina in the arm of Fish Creek on a Nature Conservancy property that had yellow toadflax. And so we did a test trial of releasing the weevils. And I think there wasn't too many weevils that we released, but I was out there last year and I was actually finding some impact from those weevils. So next, at the end of the month, South Saskatchewan River Watershed Stewards, South of the Divide, Old Wives Watershed Association, and Swift Current Creek Watershed Stewards are organizing a webinar, and they're bringing in Tim Scuzzi, who's the coordinator for the Biocontrol Release Program in Alberta. And I think it's, if you're interested in looking at biocontrol agents, I really recommend attending this webinar. And he'll be discussing some of the different tools that they're using in Alberta and sort of how effective they are as well. And I know our plant health officers here in Saskatchewan are working on different on the biocontrol agents as well, and looking at the feasibility of them. And every year they do a call out at the beginning of July for collection of leafy spurge beetles at Besant near Moose Jaw. And so yeah, really watch out for those that call out for collection dates. And I really encourage you to consider it as a tool in your arsenal. So who do we call upon if we have questions? And, there's a lot of great people to call upon. We have Ministry of Agriculture staff, people like Clark, or the range agrologists that work for the province. They have a really good, out of the Rural Services Center, a lot of them have really good background and knowledge in invasive plant species control. Also, the plant health officers as well through SARM, they have that service as well. Also, I think ourselves as weed inspectors, I find that every time we get together, we share war stories and we learn from each other. And I think that's always a great approach, that we can communicate back and forth and share these ideas. Of course, last year with COVID, we didn't have any of our weed tours that we normally do across the province, which is something I really missed. And I think that's a great place for us to get together and talk and share these ideas. So, if you're working with, you got weed inspectors nearby from other municipalities, work together, because quite often, we're dealing with the same weeds across the RM boundaries, right? So it's good to work together. I know here in Saskatoon, we're trying to work with the South Saskatchewan River Watershed Stewards to create a sort of a local, sort of a cooperative weed management area, or at least having those discussions. And so we had sort of our initial meeting a couple of weeks ago with the RM at Corman Park, City of Saskatoon, Meewasin, and also Ministry of Agriculture Lands Branch, to just start those discussions on working together on weed control options. I know the Frenchman River weed management area has been quite successful, working together with 5 municipalities and also Parks Canada down there. And so that's something that we're going to look at here in the Saskatoon region. And so we may actually start reaching out to some other municipalities like that are neighboring this area as well, to maybe have these discussions. But yeah, there's a lot of people out there, and also, the crop advisors with a lot of the ag companies as well. Quite often they have people on staff as well that can help you with dealing with invasive species in, pasture settings or other in cropland as well. How do you approach highways and railway tracks? That's, I think if anyone in the room here is a weed inspector, this is one of the biggest challenges. And, it's really difficult to develop those relationships with those entities. Who do you contact? How do you contact them? And how do you develop a partnership to get the weeds under control? So the picture on the right hand there, that's common tansy. That's actually across the road from my dad's farm out near St. Benedict. We got common tansy really bad in that area, and it's along all the highways and all the road ditches in that RM. And you can see here the ditches didn't get mowed this winter or this fall, and so common tansies everywhere, and that seed's being spread. However, when I'm driving through the area, I can really spot where the tansy is because it really sticks out. And so, how do we approach this? And I think it's trying to find that local contact within either highways or the railway, depending which railway is coming through your area, and developing those relationships. So, working with your administrator at the RM, or, even contacting Clark or the plant health officers, they might have some contacts as well, and develop those relationships. I think getting upset and sending a weed notice may or may not be effective, especially with when you think of a large railway company with their headquarters maybe in Montreal. Will that notice even get to them, right? So I think developing those relationships and finding the right people to talk to. Contact your other weed inspectors. Maybe some of them have developed those relationships. I know the weed inspector in the past at Corman Park had developed a great relationship with highways, and RM at Corman Park is doing spraying in road ditches in several of the highways. I know Alana in across the river from me here in Borden area. She's been doing some work with some of the highways departments as well for doing spraying. And so I think finding those right relationships is the key. I also know Department of Highways has a fairly decent has a small weed control program that they are working with some other custom sprayers in some areas of the province. So yeah, it's not a simple solution, and I'm always happy to hear what people have for solutions with dealing with these infrastructure routes. Another one that we commonly get is, how do we deal with gravel pits? This is actually a gravel pit off just Highway 11 near Finlater, and this is where salt cedar was found a few years ago, and which is a prohibited noxious weed. And the Native Plant Society sort of took the lead with the local weed inspector and the Ministry of Highways to get this under control. And there hasn't been any occurrence of salt cedar on that site for a couple of years now. And so I know myself with the RMs that I deal with, the RMs have their own gravel pits that I can easily access, that I go in and check every year. However, there is some private gravel pits as well, and can be quite difficult to get in there. And so, that's another thing is, working with your administrator on trying to get into these gravel pits, happen to catch guys when they're on site to get in there as well, if you're lucky. And but I know, like the one RM that I'm working for, there's a giant gravel pit in there. It's probably one of the largest ones in this province, and the safety protocols to get in there, there's no way I could probably meet the safety requirements to get into the site to even check it out. It's a fairly new pit though, so I'm not too worried about noxious weeds, but it's trying to find those relationships to get in there, and then work with the owners of those gravel pits on the weed control as well, and working with them on a management plan to deal with weeds. And it could be as simple as dealing with their spoil piles, their topsoil piles, and then also when they start going to the reclamation stage, working with them on a management strategy. So, a lot of this stuff that we deal with as weed inspectors is relationships. And so, developing those relationships, I think, are where the success is for that. Some of the different resources I mentioned before, just some more websites for you. And I know this presentation will be posted online afterwards, and so that you can access this information. I also posted the information about the biobed as well. So just gives you some additional information and sites to get information on. Okay, leave that. So with that, thank you very much for taking the time to listen to me. And I kept it relatively short because I wanted to have some opportunities for discussion. So thank you, everyone.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Ernie. We do have a couple questions. The first one is just asking if the presentation will be available to print. If it's okay with you, Ernie, we'd like to post it up on the SARM website with the webinar recording. So,
yep.
So you will be able to access it later on. Hopefully we can get it posted sooner than the other ones were. So the next one. What equipment do you recommend a weed inspector to have on hand when you add, what equipment would you recommend a weed inspector to have on hand? So we did cover that a little bit in the last webinar. That one is available for viewing, but Rennie, what would you say is the most important things to have on hand if you're going out to do an inspection?
Yeah, so myself, what I always keep in my truck with me is I have a binder, a whole bunch of information on identification. So all those fact sheets, the Forage Council's weed guide as well, even a ID book I carry with me. I carry information on herbicides with me as well when I travel. I also carry RM maps with me as well. And I also, have my cell phone with me for access to Google Maps, so I can, get a good pinpoint of where I am if I need to, and a good air photo. One of the other things I carry is I carry a handheld GPS for documenting things, so that I can go back in the future. I find like if I have a RM map that's really marked up really hard, which is great, but it doesn't pinpoint it, because an RM, a square is a half mile by half mile, and that doesn't give you that super accurate detail on where to go back. So I carry a handheld GPS, and anything I find, I handheld GPS. I also, any control I do, I handheld tag it with my GPS as well. I also travel around with herbicide with me wherever I go. Since I am an applicator as well, I do that, and I have my PPE with me. But I carry sort of 3 handheld sprayers, sort of the canister style. And one I carry with herbicide that's good for dealing with wild parsnip and common tansy. I carry one that's good for things like leafy spurge and other weeds like that. And then I also carry glyphosate as well. So if I come across something that it's a small patch and I can spray it, I spray it, and then it's dealt with. And this is in weed ditches. Don't get, this is on weed ditches, not on private land, of course. And so what I feel is if I get on top of it right away, it's dealt with. And there's nothing more satisfying than seeing the plant curling to death 2 weeks later when you check on it. So I find if you don't deal with it right away, you either forget about it or you don't have time to do it. And so having that detailed handheld GPS, make sure that you can find that right away. Also, for myself, I also carry information to give to producers and landowners as well, and ratepayers. I do have those extra copies of those weed guides. I also have extra copies of the fact sheets as well, especially the ones that I'm really dealing with in my RM. So in my RM in Aberdeen, I'm dealing with wild parsnip. I'm dealing with, starting to deal with common tansy, and I got yellow toadflax. And so I carry those fact sheets with me and hand them out to anyone that I'm talking to as well. I talked about PPE, hand tools. Yeah, so those are actually the real basics, what I carry in my kit. Oh, and then a shovel. So yeah, sometimes you can deal with some of these weeds like oxeye daisy, easy to dig them out and pull them out, or even scentless chamomile as well. Quickly pull them out, bag them, and get rid of them. So.
Perfect. Thanks, Rennie. Just one thing I wanted to mention about spraying weeds. That's one thing we do hear a lot is questions. Are weed inspectors applicators as well? And no, that is not usually the case. You don't have to spray herbicides. You don't have to become a pesticide applicator if you don't want to. That's totally up to you. That's up to you and your RM. So that's that. The rest aren't really questions. We just had a comment from Carl. He said that Tom Wolf developed the biobed. That was the name.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Tom Wolf. Sorry, Tom's son worked for me, and I couldn't remember his last name. So, yeah,
actually, there is one question there, Katie, from Rick Bilarkey.
Oh, sorry, I missed that one.
About invasive weeds. But I just wanted to add that the most important thing that a weed inspector should have in their kit is the Weed Control Act and copies of the Weed Control Act, so that you can refer to that document, so you know what your powers are and what weeds are of concern and things like that. So if you ever get challenged by a landowner that you're dealing with, then you can kind of show them right in the legislation, okay, this is what the law says right here. So you can kind of quell a lot of disputes that way by having that piece of legislation right with you when you're traveling around the RM.
Yeah,
No,
and knowing that thing inside out is very important. So you can just take it out and say, no, this is where it says that this is the law, and that's it. So
yeah, no, very good point, Clark and Katie, because yeah, I carried that in my binder with me as well as the act, the regulations, and also the listing of all the species as well. I carry that with me, and multiple copies as well, like Clark said. I have left the Weed Control Act with people in the past, just for, there were people that were quite interested in what it was all about. So, and then also I always, carry your weed inspector card with you too, to prove that you were appointed by the municipality and sanctioned by the Ministry of Agriculture to be a weed inspector.
definitely.
Yeah.
The last question for now, we just had someone wondering if when you add an invasive weed to Imap, who or where does the information go? Does it get back to the weed inspector? Yes, you can sign up for a feature that will email you if a weed is identified in your RM that you're inspecting. It pops up very quickly after it's been entered into the system. So yeah, you usually do get a notification.
Yeah, and like I'm set up for notifications in my RMs. Also, I have certain target species that I'm watching for as well. And then if it's added into the database, it doesn't matter where in the province, I get those notifications as well. So
Sure.
I find it as a very valuable resource for myself.
Yeah, just in the interest of time, we're going to cut the questions short for now, and we'll come back to them at the end if we have time. Clark, we're going to go on to your presentation. So
I gave myself permission there, so I'm good.
oh, good.
Yep. Okay. By far and away, the most common question that I get is, well, what do I do about organic producers? And so that's something that I decided to focus my presentation on here today a little bit, just to kind of provide a bit of overview as to how they may differ from your average enforcement action on somebody who really doesn't have any particular management restrictions that they're under. I think the real key thing is that anytime you're dealing with a landowner, you need to kind of take into consideration what their land management goals are, and to try and, if there's the option, to tailor some of that weed control activity to that land management goal, then try and do that as much as possible. Usually there's enough flexibility in the system that there are more than one way to skin a cat, so to speak, and we're getting we have some options to provide to people to be able to try and address the challenges that they have. So let's see if we can get this thing moving here. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to put that back. So one of the first things you want to do when you're dealing with someone who sort of pleads organic as a way to maybe deflect from their obligations, one thing to really clarify right out of the bat, or right out of the gate, is that the Act does not designate, one, that herbicides must be used to control weeds, and two, does not recognize any production choice. It just says landowner. It really doesn't care what you're doing on that land. You need to control your regulated weeds, and that's the long and the short of it right there. So there is currently a national organic standard, and essentially what that national organic standard does is it defines the product of that production process and what you can do and what you can't do in order to put that organic label on your product. It is a federal standard, but just because it's a federal standard does not mean that it supersedes the Provincial Weed Control Act. They have two different purposes, and there is no piece of legislation federally that says that organic production is enshrined somehow in some type of protection against provincial legislation. What I liken it to is that putting slicks on your car doesn't all of a sudden put you into a different class that you're not adhering to the Highway Traffic Act. So it's the same kind of thing that this is just here. If you want to call your product organic, these are the limitations that you need to follow in order to put that label on your product. And that federal legislation doesn't compel a person to be organic or use organic practices either. So that organic production practice is ultimately, it's a producer choice. And so sometimes that choice may be appropriate for the land in question, and sometimes it may not be appropriate for the land in question. So that's sometimes the debate that has to kind of take place with respect to weeds, regulated weeds that are growing on organic land. One thing to make sure is that your organic producer is certified by a recognized third party. And typically that third party arrangement is required in order to make sure that that organic standard is being maintained and can be confirmed by that certifying agency. Different certifying bodies have different requirements from the perspective of stewardship as well. Some are just strictly concerned about what the product looks like coming out the end, and they really don't care how you beat your land up in the process. Other organizations that are involved in certifying, they have some requirements in there as well about stewardship of the land. And so what they indicate in their certification processes is that thou shalt rotate in perennial forages every so often within your rotation in order, one, to introduce nitrogen back into the land, so legume forages to introduce nitrogen back in, and reintroduce carbon back into the land because they recognize that tillage is going to be reducing that carbon in the soil. And also that forage is also very good for reducing the annual weeds that are typically problems in organic production. So some agencies will have that stewardship process built in. And one thing that you can do is just, if you have someone who is not certified by a third party, they're just somebody that doesn't like pesticides. So they're not considered officially organic from an industry perspective under that national standard. So they have to be certified, and by a third-party agency, and they have to be actively producing a product out the other end. And so generally what will happen is that a lot of those certifying bodies will also ask those producers to contact their local RM that they live in or that they're growing crops in, and just alert them that, okay, this field is organic, and it doesn't necessarily mean that the RM can't spray the ditch beside that organic land, although there are some organic producers that are a little bit possessive about that land that neighbors their field. Or that right of way that neighbors their field, and can get a little bit testy about that process. But essentially, the RM does own that right of way. It's sort of not necessarily title terms, but they are responsible for the management of that right of way. And the organic producer is required to mitigate any risk in that situation by having a buffer on their own property and not using the ditch as a buffer. There are certain circumstances that the ditch can be used as the buffer as long as that organic producer receives the permission and blessing of the RM to be able to do that. And so when that land gets recognized as organic land, then essentially when ditch spraying might be getting done, then it just means that, well, let's take a little bit more precautions to make sure that we avoid any concerns. We should be avoiding concerns of drift onto neighboring land anyway, but we're just being extra cautious just to be nice to the landowner in that perspective. So I would suggest that because they need to be certified, ask to see their certification. All organic producers will have a certificate to show that they were certified by one of those third-party agencies. If they're selling less than $5,000, they are exempt from that certification requirement, though. So essentially, those folks they're selling the odd veggie at the local farmers market kind of thing, or they might have a stand at the side of the road or something like that. So they're not selling large volumes of product. The other component to that is producers that are transitioning land, and land that's under transition is not yet certified, but you should be able to ask that producer to see his application that he submitted, or a copy of the application that he submitted to the certification body, so that you can kind of confirm that they're in the process of transition. I would suggest that I had some feedback on myself there for a second. I get a phone call and my system cuts out here, so I apologize for that. A perfect time to reduce the weed population on a parcel of land that's going in and transitioning to organics is to seed an alfalfa brome forage into that land and have that through the transition period. And the other thing that is required for buffers on organic land is that they be visibly different from the crop itself. So you can't have a crop of wheat and then your buffer also be wheat. It has to be something visually distinctive from that wheat crop that's certified organic. So that's something else to kind of keep in mind. If you're not getting cooperation from the organic producer in working on managing their noxious weeds, then what you can do is lodge a complaint with that third-party certifying body. And so what that does is that puts a red flag on that property for certification. And there are some agencies that essentially say that issue needs to be dealt with before certification can be issued. Again, some certification bodies are going to be a little bit more uptight about that than others. And the other thing to kind of keep in mind is that from the perspective of applying herbicides to organic land, does that constitute crop destruction? And there, to my knowledge, there has been no civil case law determining that the application of a selective herbicide that does not kill the crop but kills the weeds selectively and being applied to a field that's certified organic and consistent with all the labels, use patterns with the product, that constitutes crop destruction. Yes, the certification will be lost on that parcel, but that isn't necessarily the destruction of the crop. And so that whole question still has to be worked out in a court, and I'm sure every RM is willing to step up and volunteer to be the first case to go through that system to find out what that judge is going to say. I think the real key is that you want to be flexible, like I talked about earlier. The Weed Act doesn't dictate that herbicides must be used to control the weeds. And the Act does give a lot of latitude to the weed inspector to choose the best management activity that will fit the specific situation. So some flexibility in figuring out what's going to work best for that landowner in their discussions with them, I think goes a long way to getting compliance to the legislation. And there are lots of ways culturally to manage weeds, especially when you're dealing with things like nuisance or established noxious weeds. So we've got things like bile control, and we've got tillage, and we've got mowing, and we've got grazing sheep, and we've got all kinds of options. And we've even now got attachments that we stick on the back of our combines that pulverize weeds coming out the back of the combine and reduce the soil seed bank of weeds. So there's lots of mechanisms to be able to manage weeds without the use of herbicides. And in some cases, those mechanisms probably should be more integrated into everyday ag production as well, in order to stave off things like herbicide resistance. So yeah, enforcement may need to be a little bit more nuanced with organic producers. Prohibited weeds, though, they're a whole new kettle of fish. Those things, they need to be dead in the most dead way that you can make them dead. So it's the most effective method. Doesn't matter what it is. If it's an annual plant, so if it's Renee's Himalayan balsam, that's an annual plant, you pull that thing out before it produces seed or before it flowers, game over. It's all done. So as long as you get the whole plant, everything's good. So in that case, you didn't have to have herbicide used. There are a few plants on the weed list that are like that, but we also have to recognize that perennial plants are going to be a little bit tougher nut to crack, and they may need the use of herbicides in order to address that perennial root system on that plant. And it's the law. An organic producer is not exempt from the Weed Control Act. They're just like any other landowner. That organic certification does not supersede any federal or provincial laws. I know the organic producer is going to like the opportunity to manage those weeds first in methods that are going to allow them to maintain their certification. But this also needs to be proactive and aggressive. It can't just be, well, we'll just see what happens next year. There needs to be a plan set in place. There needs to be a very deliberate approach to dealing with that weed problem on that land. And if the weed can't be managed in any other way, then a herbicide might be considered. And then, especially if it's a smaller isolated patch, herbicide might be considered, especially one that really doesn't have a soil residue to it. And then that organic buffer can be drawn around that isolated patch, and the organic production can take place around that sprayed area. So we don't necessarily have to take out the entire field in order to manage a small area of weeds in one portion of the field. So what does the RM need to do in this scenario? Well, those who live in glass houses cannot throw stones. And so that means that the RM needs to have the cleanest right-of-ways and the cleanest properties in the RM. So they need to be leading by example first, so that you don't get any corporate salutes where you've got fingers pointing in opposite directions at who's to blame other than who's standing in front of you. So that's the first step, is that the RM needs to have their own process, they need to have their own strategy, and they need to have their own priorities set as far as what are the weeds of concern within the province or within the RM. And that weed management plan cannot specify any production practice that's specific to an individual, let's say. So we can't single out people. This has to be a blanket policy that covers every landowner in the RM, and every landowner in the RM needs to be bound by that policy. So develop a weed management plan for the municipality. What it does is it sets the priorities for the RM, and you communicate that out widely to every ratepayer, so that everyone knows what the ground rules are going into the season. And what it does is it also sets reasonable goals for the RM to be able to deal with their own weeds on their own right-of-ways as well. So it's something that's always a good thing to have there. And that weed management plan, that's essentially going to be the North Star for the weed inspector as well. Because if you've got a bunch of conflicting interests and the RM has said, oh, okay, well, this is the weed of concern, then what you can do is you can take that weed management plan with you to the landowner, and you can show him that this is now a priority of the RM, that we're working to deal with this on our own land as well, and we're making sure that everybody is taking these weeds seriously on their land. And communication is a huge element of that. Make sure that that plan is communicated widely, so that nobody has the excuse that they didn't know that this was going on. And so the other thing that is really, really important is that the whole idea of RMs backing away from enforcement. And when you're enforcing the Weed Control Act, it's absolutely critical that you have the support of your RM, and that weed management plan is a signal of support from your RM as well. If they're not willing to sit down and do the municipal weed plan, they're not going to have your back if you run into a dispute with the landowner. So that's something that really needs to take place, and it really needs to be something that guides your activities. So that's something to really kind of impress on the folks that are at the helm of the RM. And as one thing that kind of goes along with that is that if we start going down an enforcement pathway, and we're at the point where we're issuing orders and we're telling people that they need to do something, the enforcement process can't stop there. Because if the enforcement process stops there, then that's a signal to that landowner that the RM is not serious when they send out those orders. And then that becomes a legal precedent, so that any future activity, if for whatever reason the RM changes their mind and they all of a sudden decide to get serious about this, then you can't just turn that ship around. And so in order to do that, you're going to have a widespread communication plan to say, yeah, it was this way before, but you know what, now we're changing that. Fair notice, here's what's going to happen this year and what's coming down the pipe. So all that communication stuff needs to be in place as well. So that's what I had here for today. I hope that was useful for folks. I know that tends to be a common question. So I guess, Katie, questions?
Sure. We did have one just left over from Rennie's presentation. He asked, how do you engage a landowner in a long-term biocontrol of 5 or more years?
5 years is a short-term biocontrol situation. As we had discussed earlier, I'm not entirely sure what that's referring to. When we have a situation where we've got biocontrol in an area, generally where we're at when we introduce biocontrol is that we've got large tracts of land that are solid stands, and essentially it's prohibitively expensive to turn the clock back and try and eradicate that weed. So the biocontrol is put into that situation in order to reduce the impact of that weed on that land, not to eradicate it, because the bug will never eat itself out of house and home. There's always going to be some weeds, and there's always going to be some bugs. So that's just the fact of life. What we do recommend take place is that in those areas where you do have one of those populations that's a wide, extensive population, and it's prohibitive to try and manage that on a more aggressive basis, and now you're looking at integrated weed management in those areas. It's important to have a sort of no man's land buffer zone around that managed area. That essentially you do that with herbicides and surround that the boundary of that land base that's being managed with the biocontrol or other integrated management practices like sheep or goats or whatever. And the idea of that is you have to have that buffer big enough so that that weed will not jump that gap and spread to other areas outside that are not infested yet. And so that's the idea of having that buffer in that field. It's too bad I didn't have a picture of that on hand to show you kind of what it looks like. With leafy spurge, that's really easy because when leafy spurge sheds its seeds, it only spits them up to 20 feet. So as long as you make that buffer 30 feet, 25 or 30 feet, you've got that covered. And essentially you're going through there with herbicides and you're making sure that it's treated on a regular basis so that no spurge ever sets seed in that area. And then there is going to be the occasional situation where that spurge may jump that buffer area via another pathway, and that could be in the belly of a deer, or it could be in the belly of a bird that's eating the seeds and goes and sits on a telephone wire and then craps the seed out underneath the telephone wire. So there are situations where it will jump, but having that buffer minimizes the ability of that population to jump wholesale over that boundary and into the neighboring area. So that's probably as best answer as I can provide for the question given. And that's the thing with, because those large tracts of land are now established noxious weeds, areas bigger than 5 hectares. Now we're looking at integrated management practices as the name of the game within those areas. And eradication is not really on the table.
Perfect. Thanks, Clark. I got one via email. He asked, how come the Organic Association didn't regulate the weeds on a producer's land?
Why does the Organic Association, so you mean this, presumably that means the certifying body. I'm going to make that assumption at this point. You have to realize what the business of the certifying body is. And it's not to do the weed inspector's job for them or the landowner's job for them as far as the maintenance of that property. Their job is to ensure that that certified organic sticker can be placed on any products that come off of that property. And that's their sole purpose for being. That's why they're called a certifying body, not an organic management agency. So because they're certifying that, okay, you, Mr. Organic Producer, have only used this process, and you haven't used any prohibited substances in the production of this crop, you get a check mark and you can now put the organic logo on this product and sell it as such to any buyers that want to pay a premium to buy that product. And so that's really the essence of what the certifying body is about. It's really up to the individual landowner to make sure that they are managing their land in such a way as to, 1, get the most out of it, 2, be environmentally responsible, and 3, manage their invasive species. And that's being part of being environmentally responsible. So I think that's the essence of the answer to that question.
Perfect. Yeah, I think that answers it. I don't see any more questions coming up. So I guess
I did put a couple of things in the chat as we were kind of going through. One thing to note is that in the 2021 Guide to Crop Protection, we have added some of the industrial vegetation management herbicides to the guide this year. that process wasn't complete because I was kind of on my own. Usually I get help from the folks from Manitoba, and my counterpart from Manitoba and I work on that section together. There was no counterpart from Manitoba this fall when we were working on it. So I was kind of left to my own devices. And so we got a few of those products into the guide, but it's not complete by any means. So we're hoping to get that process completed next edition. And then I had left a note on the Imap Invasives reporting system, and if the RM signs up and gets their own user ID, they can also kind of have a checkbox that they want to get email notifications from the system when someone adds a new weed to or a new observation using Imap Invasives to any land within the boundaries of that RM. So that's an important thing, is for you could add that answer, Colleen. That'd be awesome, because I know you know it. So yeah, it's a really handy function there, and it'll notify the RM, and whoever's looking after the RM account, they'll be the ones that get the email. And so whoever that is can notify the weed inspector to kind of go and check it out.
Sure. Rennie, do you know the species name of the toadflax weevil? Was that the stem galling weevil?
I think that's what it was, yeah.
Okay. Okay, next question. Which chemical has been most effective on small patches of common tansy in your experience, Rennie?
What I use either Clearview or I use Milestone, depending where I'm spraying. So that's what I find the most effective. But it's, quite often what you have to do is it's multiple applications. So you do a one-time spray, you knock the population back, and then you have to do a follow-up either year 2 or year 3 for any new regrowth or any seedling emergence. So it's not just a one-time shot. You have to look at it multiple years. And it's very similar to things like leafy spurge as well, right? You don't have to go multiple years. It's not just a one-time thing.
Anything to add, Clark?
No, I was going to say the same thing. I would have suggested either Clearview or Milestone. So, and if we're looking at range and pasture equivalents to those two products, then we're looking at Restore is the equivalent to the range and pasture equivalent to Milestone, and Reclaim is the pasture equivalent to Clearview. And really the only difference between the range and pasture products and the industrial vegetation products is that the range and pasture products come pre-packed with 2,4-D ester.
Awesome. Another question, has there been any biocontrol for common burdock?
None that I'm aware of.
It would sure be nice though.
Yeah, it's probably getting to that point, yeah.
Okay,
Yeah,
so far there's
common burdock is not that uncommon, really.
yeah. Yeah, so far there's no more questions, so I think we're going to call that a wrap for the day. We're well over time. Just one more thing to mention, we are going to be, due to popular demand, we're going to be having one more webinar in April, and it's going to be on weed ID. Just before the season gets going, we're going to focus a little bit on the weeds themselves. I believe Clark is going to be leading that one. So stay tuned for a link to that webinar. As for this webinar, we're going to be having it posted on the SARM website in the same place as the other ones are. When they are posted, I will be sending out an email to everybody, just so they know that they're up. And yeah, for now, thank you so much to Rennie for helping us out with this presentation, and thank you to Clark, as always, for giving us a hand with it as well. So thank you to everybody for showing up, and I hope that you gained a lot of information today. I know I sure did. So all right, thanks everybody, have a great day.
Okay. Thanks, Katie.
Thanks, Katie.
Thanks, Clark.
Thanks, Randy.